London's burning, London's burning. Fetch the engine, fetch the engine. Cold water, cold water. Fire, fire, cold water.
Would you like to drive a fire engine when you grow up?
Nah.
London's Burning is a show I've watched a lot, with it becoming one of my favourite shows of all time within only a few months of discovering it. As someone who grew up on Fireman Sam, with some of my earliest memories being that show, an adult-aimed show about the lives of firefighters would of course appeal to me. So one Christmas the pilot movie was on TV and I happened to catch some of it. From that moment I was hooked, and binged the entire show several times over. So with my growing desire to talk about shows that have made an impact on me, it was only a matter of time until London's Burning was brought to the forefront of my list. And by that I mean find the time to watch the show again and work out how I was going to approach it. So with London's Burning now rewatched again, and with notes taken, it's time to get the show underway. But before we can get onto the show, we need to go back to the very beginning and start with the pilot movie. So let's go back to 1986. The pilot movie for London's Burning is both very unlike the show and at the same time the blueprint for the majority of the show going forward, at least in its earliest years. While a movie about firefighting could easily have been just pure spectacle, the pilot movie is far more than that. So the TV movie has two main plot lines, those being of Josie Ingham, the first firewoman at Blackwall Fire Station, and that of Ethnic and his general life in the Blackwall area and his career. The movie was partly made in response to the Broadwater Farm Riot on October 6, 1985, which was the first time a fire member attacked during a riot. The riot which was triggered by building tensions between the white police and the black community. Discussing the riot itself isn't the point of this, as I'm talking about the movie made in response to it, but given its origins I have to address it, and I doubt I'm really the person best equipped for giving a full breakdown of the events. How the riot plays into the plot of the pilot is complex, with it being built up to throughout, with a stronger focus in the second half. The first half focuses more on Josie Ingham and her struggles before shifting to Ethnic in the second, although both their stories are continued throughout the entire thing. I'll talk about Josie first, as she takes up the majority of the first half. So as stated, Josie was Blackwall's first firewoman, with her being written in response to the fact that women were slowly entering the service at the time. This section of the story has two sides to it. Josie's as an unwanted member of the Watch, with her being unaccepted for a long time, or just being seen as a woman, rather than the firewoman, then the side of the Watch who don't quite know how to handle it. I'll start with Josie's side of things. So upon her arrival she is met by immediate hostility, with the Watch not knowing what to do around her and treating her without any respect on shouts. While the first shout shows this to a degree, with her not having anything to do, with Rambo taking over for her keeping the public under control twice and freeing a hose that had become trapped. The public don't really have much opportunity to treat her with a lack of respect, but they just think she's a guy, based on one of them calling her son while trying to keep them back. Now obviously being the new member of the Watch would be hard enough for anyone, especially since she doesn't get a chance to try and introduce herself to anyone before the bells went down, meaning she couldn't even attempt to act as a member of the team. But since she was being met by this complete lack of respect, it meant that any hope she had of doing anything was taken away from her. This continues into the next shout we see. This time she actively attempts to get something to do, and all she can get back from Bayleaf is being told to sort a cup of tea. Now I'll cover this further in the section on the Watcher's reaction to her, due to this fitting into how she is viewed as just a woman. But this view of her affects a considerable amount of the plot until she finally speaks out against them during the night. This scene is truly great as she puts herself out there, being incredibly open with her revealing her own hang-ups about joining the brigade, which leads into a round of applause by Ethnic, before someone, presumably Vaseline, farting. Which to me feels like a moment of acceptance, which while the moment of acceptance can be argued as a later scene as it serves it better, the fact of how they've been acting around her by treating her as just a woman rather than a firewoman, this immature and somewhat manly act being done in front of her just gives the impression of his acting as a first moment of acceptance. But what is almost certainly the true moment of acceptance comes around the halfway point, so I'll talk about that once I've covered the view of Josie by the Watch. So on the Watch themselves, as mentioned before, they only see Josie as a woman. They don't respect her for being a firewoman and instead only treat her with a lack of respect, not allowing her to do anything and only giving her menial jobs when she asks. Their immediate reaction to her shows their views very clearly, as they're just in shock with no idea what to do, with Rambo standing up in awkwardness. This of course continues into the shout as explained before, but prior to Josie's arrival we get to see Tate and Hallam talking about her incoming arrival. Their dialogue, while not directly addressing Josie as being a female, they aren't subtle about the probable reaction which would have occurred had Tate told the Watch during roll call. It's a good scene to set up the characters that will be affected by the big event without actually having it occur immediately. It also means that as an audience we'll jump into our own conclusions about what the shake-up could be before its reveal. This is something which continues with Tate, with him trying to shield the lads to the best of his ability, which probably didn't help Josie, with Tate's decision to send Sick Note away when Josie first arrived, so he didn't see her, was perhaps a bad move, as it meant that he was just a part of the larger shock instead of potentially being won over or more on Josie's side. It does make sense why Tate does this, but for Josie's prospects as a member of the Watch, all his decisions work against her having much immediate success. I've already discussed the Watcher's immediate reaction to her and covered most of the events which occur on the shout, but I will bring up this line from the end of the first shout.
Hello! Nice you to turn up! Where's the fire?
It's a good line which really shows their dismissiveness of her, with them having a mocking nature towards her trying to help, as she can only do something when there's nothing left to do. I mentioned the view of Josie as just a woman before with the tea scene, as that's really the first time that things are calm enough for this sort of scene. But when she first meets the lads, there are several comments with Ethnic looking her up and down. But to expand on this view of her, I'll talk about the scenes in the station prior to them going to sleep. We immediately begin with Josie being alone in the mess, with her being entirely ignored by Bayleaf and Charisma. The most notable scene is when Sick Note, Malcolm and Ethnic are watching some quality adult entertainment, with them discussing what to do if Josie walks in, as they see her as a woman who would disapprove of their habits because she is a woman, and she doesn't even know they're all married or at least taken. Ultimately having different ideas of how to handle the situation, with Malcolm's suggestion being the one taken, that being just to leave it on, which they do when Josie enters, although she plays them at their own game, by casually walking in, sitting down and waiting for a bit before leaving with a final scathing retort to their retorts. We also have her getting Vaseline into trouble by interrupting his phone call with Marion. The final scene before Josie puts them in their places between Rambo and Tate, discussing sleeping arrangements, or rather the awkwardness of going to bed with a woman around. It's a fun little scene, with it basically being the only scene with Rambo as a prominent character, but I'll talk about that later. This scene serves its purpose well, with it being used to demonstrate some of the insecurities of the lads which haven't really been shown off. It's a scene which is effective at showing off the view of Josie as just a woman, while at the same time allowing the lads, or at least Rambo, to be seen as a bit more than just sexist, which I think is good for adding a bit of depth to the lads. As I've already talked about the night scene, let's move on to the shout which fully changes the view of the lads and gives us the real moment of acceptance. So between these two scenes, at least a day has passed, with several events occurring, but they aren't that important to this part of the discussion. Although Josie isn't present at Vaseline's wedding, she has a scene where she talks with her husband about the watch, where she has become friendly with at least Bayleaf, as he has been telling her about the rest of the watch, mostly the origins of their nicknames. A scene which I can't show you due to it featuring a considerable lack of clothing. There are also a few scenes with her being around the lads in the station, even though not really talking with them. Now on the shout. For a bit of important context, a man has caught himself in the curtain ring, a situation which seemingly requires the entire watch to slowly be called up to examine the man's predicament and think of solutions. Before the watch actually enter the man's flat, we have a scene of Josie and Bayleaf talking, with Bayleaf opening up to her, with him being far more open than he ever intended to be. But once everyone has entered the flat and assessed the situation, Josie is brought up as a joke, but it pays off as it is her who is the one who comes up with the most reasonable solution, that being to reduce the swelling with ice. From there the Watcher are a lot more friendly with her and have accepted her, with them all having a laugh about what happened, much to Josie's annoyance. But they decide she needs a nickname, and given the reputation of nicknames within the brigade, it's clear that by this point Josie has been accepted by them. This also comes at the halfway point with the plot shifting towards Ethnic for the rest, meaning that this moment serves its purpose well at ending Josie's arc. Now obviously this doesn't mean that Josie fades into the background, but her plotline isn't an A plot anymore. For the rest of the pilot, Josie is used as the audience avatar, with her falling for the Watcher's pranks and not knowing them well enough to understand that charisma is not all that he makes himself out to be. Her main dynamic is with Bayleaf, who has become her closest friend, to the point that her husband is annoyed by it, viewing them as more than just mates. We have several scenes of the two of them talking or doing the shopping together. Watching this shift of how friendly the Watch and Josie are as the plot proceeds is great, with many of the scenes being very humorous. So let's get on to Ethnic and his place in the story. As mentioned at the beginning, the pilot was written in response to the Broadwater farm riots the year before, with Ethnic being the character at the centre of it, allowing for viewers to see him in similar events. The riot breaks out towards the end, but there is build-up throughout the pilot. From near the beginning there is a sense of something is going to happen at some point. We have the police constantly stopping people to search them or having a clear suspicion of the local residents, while at the same time no respect being shown by the locals towards the police, which is something you can't blame them for. The community itself is presented as being split, with Ethnic's friends and family being separated from the more aggressive members. Neither side of this conflict is shown with much in terms of redeeming features, with the police coming off far worse as we get Ethnic and his mates who are presented as people who are just living with the situation they are caught in, with Ethnic's family being scared of their neighbours. This group don't partake in the riot or the drug dealing, which is the only thing justifying the police presence in the area. But due to the nature of the police at the time, it doesn't matter to them. Ethnic does seem dismissive towards both sides, but still treating them both differently to a degree, with him viewing people as people rather than by colour or creed. The scene which shows off just how far up themselves the police are is when they first stop Ethnic, with them viewing him through their biased eyes until they see he is a fireman, which causes them to act friendly and chummy towards him. Now yes, I think Ethnic should have walked around them instead of pushing through the middle, but they are the ones to call him by a slur. So with that set up, let's let's talk about Ethnic himself before we get onto the riot. Ethnic is an interesting character, almost entirely because we get to see his dynamics with many different types of people. Unlike with Josie, the Watch don't view Ethnic for his colour, with him being one of the lads throughout, although we don't get an origin for his nickname like with the others, with presumably coming from the fact that he was the only black member of the Watch, and more than likely one of the earliest black members of the brigade. The only exception from the Watch is Vaseline, who while is able to work with him perfectly fine, does show racist tendencies towards his colleague, which the others don't tend to push back against while Ethnic just deals with it, seeing Vaseline for what he is, an idiot. There are occasions when Vaseline does push too far, which leads to confrontations, notably when they have a brief food fight, and later when they nearly get into a punch-up while on the way to a shout, only stopped by Josie. Oddly though, Ethnic is present at Vaseline's wedding, which is something that somewhat bugs me, because I can't think why he would be present, well other than making a funny joke. Ethnic doesn't have a dynamic with Josie, despite being the two main characters of the pilot, and the two standouts of the Watch, which I think is good, as it does make it they're the two diverse characters being put together. But Ethnic is the one to applaud Josie after her speech, presumably due to him going through similar events when he joined the brigade. On a more general view of him in the brigade, we don't really see the grander view of people of colour in the brigade, but Ethnic is up for promotion and is soon to be transferred to another station at the leading hand, showing a very different view that the brigade has from the police. On his family and mates, we see the lighter side of the community, the clear victims of the police and the community. His family feel the more notable as they are entirely supported by Ethnic, which is something which causes problems for his mother, who feels uncomfortable about being able to shop at more expensive and high-class places. There is a sense of fear that comes from his parent, with them being trapped in this area where things are about to blow up, with Ethnic being desperate to get them out of it. Ethnic also has a girlfriend, but she's less important than his family are within the plot. The separation between Ethnic and his community is important to the riot at the end. Well, I did talk about the scene where he was stopped by the police. This happens again later, but this time is witnessed by a group who proceed to follow him and see him on duty while at school. This causes a divide between them, with an attempted arson attack on his house. The riot brings this to its conclusion, so I'll talk about the riot itself now. The scenes prior to the riot are a lot less subtle in the final build-up, with preparations being made for a battle, with stuff being moved to higher levels and slabs being broken up to throw. The riot breaks out with a car fire, which leads to Blue Watch being called in to deal with it. The police are also brought in force, with riot shields being used to hold back the opposition, with anyone who is caught being brutally beaten. Blue Watch are caught up in the crossfire, with stones being thrown at the appliances, and them having to retreat from the fireground. Separated from them and is nearly killed, but is saved by Ethnic, who had taken the day off prior to his final day on the Watch. Ethnic in fact went down to save someone else, but ended up saving Charisma instead, leading to a slab being dropped on him which causes his death. These final few scenes are powerful. We have scenes set in his house where his family mourns him, while others at Blackwall, where the Watch are eating the farewell meal they had made. This scene is very heavy and really shows how powerful his death was. There is not a single line of dialogue, with the only action being Charisma pushing his plate away, which Vaseline pushes back, the meal being disrupted by the bells going down, and they're forced to leave it unfinished. The final scene sees the Watch at roll call, with a new member of the Watch having taken Ethnic's place. That wraps the plot up, with the pilot ending on a rather sad note. It's a very tragic movie by the end, with it using its inspiration as a springboard for a mostly fun movie until the final few minutes. But we've still got a lot to talk about, as we have the rest of the Watch to look at, alongside the shouts. So let's discuss the shouts first, as there are a handful, and it's easier to get them out of the way first. So there are a total of 5 shouts throughout the pilot, mostly consisting of fires. We have a garage fire, a shed fire, a house fire, and the car fire at the end. The only other shout is the man who trapped himself in the curtain ring. These shouts all have a level of importance, either showing off the characters and their dynamics with one another, or being used to move the plot along. The first shout is obviously used to show off the Watch in action and how Josie doesn't fit in. The shed fire also serves this purpose too, while also playing a part in Vaseline's story, with him moonlighting and him being the one responsible for the fire. The next shout is the curtain ring one, which I've already discussed in full, but it's a gag shout which serves to bring the Watch over to Josie's side, while also demonstrating the weirder stuff that the brigade has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. The house fire allows for the pilot to show off the BA equipment and how that sort of fire is dealt with, which is also the most impressive looking shout in the pilot. This shout also serves to show the effects of a death, with Bailey taking the immediate brunt of it, lashing out against the mother who left her kids alone. I'll talk about the impact on the characters when I cover the characters, but it's one of the strongest scenes in the pilot, which really hits you hard. The final shout is of course the one connected to Ethnic's death, and so there really isn't anything else to say about it. On the rest of the cast, we've got quite a few characters to cover, but I'll start by talking about them as firemen rather than the characters individually. So before discussing them, I want to address the casting process, that basically being to find actors who weren't notable. The production crew went out of their way to source up and coming actors rather than big names, which runs counter to the traditional method of casting where you want big names. The point of this decision was to avoid the audience viewing the cast as actors. They needed to be mostly unrecognisable so that they would be seen as firemen first. In some ways, the pilot wanted to be viewed like a documentary about firemen rather than a movie. This dedication attention to making it feel real goes beyond just the casting, with the pilots having a London Brigade advisor, that being one station officer Brian Noddy Clark, who worked with the production to help keep it accurate and to avoid presenting the brigade in a bad way. This choice does benefit the film as it adds a level of realism to it, which makes the tragic moments hit harder. So on the cast themselves, Andreas Ethnic Lewis, played by Gary MacDonald, and Josie Ingham, played by Catherine Rogers, I've already covered in full, so I'll leave them and go on to the rest of the cast. Going in credited order, we first have Roland Vaseline Cartwright, played by Mark Arden. Vaseline is the idiot at the watch, with him being the one who is constantly moonlighting, with him causing the fire for one of the shouts. I've talked about his dynamic with Ethnic, which is probably his worst trait, although he isn't a character with any redeeming features. We get to see his wedding, which is to his third wife, who shares the name and looks of his previous one, who he divorced only the day before his wedding, with him going straight to a moonlighting job after the service has taken place. His nickname comes from the fact that he is slippery, with him having a reputation as a womanizer. Next is Mike Bailey Wilson, played by James Hazeldine. He's probably the most expanded on of the cast outside of the two who the pilot is about. His prominence almost certainly comes from the fact that he is the first to really act friendly with Josie, which pushes him forwards, but also due to Hazeldine being the standout of the cast as the A1 who was a well-known actor with star power. He's the mess manager, with him being the one who tends to have to deal with the childish nature of the watch when Tate and Hallam aren't around. He has some tragedy in his past, with his wife having left him and taking their daughter with her, something he doesn't even tell the lads. His nickname comes from the fact that he is the mess manager. Next up is Station Officer Sidney Tate, played by James Marcus. Tate is the oldest member of the watch and commands a high level of respect, due to his long service and way of handling both the station and shouts. Tate is quite well explored, with us getting to see a bit of his home life, with him having a somewhat strained relationship with his wife, which comes from his job. We meet his wife, who also works for the brigade, but in the control room, with her often having to send her husband into danger. Tate has an interest or perhaps obsession with Alexandra Palace, with him building a matchstick model of it in his spare time and on duty. His obsession with it has taken a big toll on him, due to it nearly burning down in 1980, with the brigade unable to save it, which is potentially what began his obsession with it. Next is Sub-Officer John Hallam, played by Sean Blowers. Out of the main cast, he is probably the least well served, with him fading into the background on many occasions. Basically all we know about him is that he's married and we briefly meet his wife, but that's about it for him. He is the second in command of the station, but despite the high number of shouts, it's always Tate front and centre, with Hallam not even present for a few of them. Next is leading hand Malcolm Cross, played by Rupert Baker, the third in command of the watch, but he's quite the troublemaker, often creating wheezes which get him into trouble. He is a lot posher in voice than the rest of his peers, which makes him distinctly stand out when he speaks. Malcolm is the one who feels the most out of place as a fireman, but does his job well when he is on a shout, and takes the job seriously when there's lives on the line. Like with Hallam, we do briefly meet his wife. Next is Bert Sickno Quigley, played by Richard Walsh, who gets his nickname from the fact that he constantly has some sort of affliction, with him having a bad back, shoulder problems and toothache, among others. He's mostly a Joe character in all things, with him being left behind on the first shout. His most notable scene is when he goes for a checkup, only to find that he can't get a sick note. Like with the previous two, we also meet his wife Jean Quigley. Next is Leslie Charisma Appleby, played by James Horan, a character whose nickname comes from the fact that he is none. He can often be found bigging himself up to his mates by talking about his very false life. We have him pretending to get bacon cheaper, but took a loss on it, something Bayleaf uncovers due to a price sticker remaining on one of the packets, alongside talking about being a member of a snooker club, but when Josie goes to watch him play in the tournament, discovers he is in fact just the guy who writes up the scores. Bayleaf is somewhat protective of him at times, but this is mostly shown by him not admitting to knowing about the bacon and making sure Josie keeps quiet. There is something tragic about Charisma, but he's a thoroughly enjoyable character to watch due to the performance. The final member of the watch is Kenny Rambo Baines, played by Jerome Flynn, probably the actor who has become the most famous following the pilot. His nickname comes from the fact that he's muscle-bound, and so is in reference to the movie character of the same name. There isn't too much to him, but he is the one to have actual concerns about going to sleep while Josie's around, and does somewhat tease Tate about Alexandria Palace by talking about how it burns down so often, while also showing a complete lack of knowledge about history due to him being completely wrong about events and the years they happened. Like with several others, we do meet his wife. So now that I've covered the watch, I want to talk about the fallout of the house fire shout. So other than Ethnic's death, this is the shout which holds weight due to a child who dies in the blaze. Bayleaf has an immediate reaction with him lashing out at the mother due to her leaving to go to a disco, but the rest of the watch have a strong reaction to it once the shout is over, with some scenes which have them sitting mostly alone in silence. Even as the appliances are heading back to the station, the crew are just sat without much emotion on their faces, which continues once at the station, with them basically all being by themselves or halfway across a room from another person. Hallam is really the only one doing anything with him trying to do paperwork, but he just can't keep going and gives up. Josie ends up walking around, which takes us through a bit of the station, showing the watch coming to terms with the tragedy. She does eventually stop to talk with Bayleaf, who's at the back of one of the appliances. The scene has some music playing, but is basically silent, which helps the audience to take in the impact it had on the characters, which strengthens the impact on us. It is very much a precursor to the scenes which follow Ethnic's death, which gives the audience a chance to be prepared for another saddening scene, but one that hits harder due to it being a character we've grown to like. I want to briefly talk about the wives of the watch, as there is a brief scene where they're all together, which is where we meet most of them. This scene is partly to give more character to Josie's husband Jerry, but also to characterise how the brigade affects the wives of the firemen. For the most part, the wives don't have any dialogue, with Jerry doing almost all the speaking in the scene. The wives themselves don't have anything in common other than their husbands, with them just sort of being pulled together by that, with it being Tate's idea for them to have these gatherings rather than their own. The scene serves mostly to worsen Jerry, who throughout has proven to be dismissive of Josie's job and the rest of the watch. For the most part, it feels like the most throwaway scene in the entire film, but I think having this scene which establishes the wives as basically being a second thought to the members of the watch is good. It gives a sense of them having thrown something away for their job, and that someone is going to be hurt if something happens to them on a shout. There's probably something more to it that I'm not seeing, but the focus on Jerry does always take away from it for me. I haven't touched on the production side so far, and I want to address it because this is one amazing looking TV movie. The high production values really show during the shouts, where we've got a combination of location and studio work for the house fire, while the others are entirely done on location. How they achieve the fires is incredible, as they look so real, with the garage and house fires having such strong blazes which is somewhat impossible to imagine how it wasn't a real fire. The location work is a standout, as being able to simulate the fires on the streets and make it seem that the places were actually on fire really adds to the realism of the movie. We've also got a considerable amount of filming which was done at the real-life Dockhead Fire Station, which is used for Blackwall Station, with the filming taking place while the station was still active. While the cast do make the scripts and scenes powerful, the behind-the-scenes crew did an incredible job to bring this world to life. So that basically wraps up everything I have to say about London's Burning. Despite being nearly 40 years old, this TV movie holds up well. Its strengths are just how unsubtle it is, somewhat forcing the realities of the world and the brigade down your throat, and using a cast of colourful and somewhat cartoony characters to make it feel real. But anyone who knows about this pilot knows that it wouldn't remain alone for long, with a long-running TV series soon following it up, so we're far from done with London's Burning and Blue Watch.